Welcome to the Basics of Faith-Based Public Advocacy. This is a mini-series hosted by the Province 5 of the Episcopal Church and the Public Theology Network of Province 5. So I am thrilled to be here with you all. This is session 3. Session 3, can I say that? Religious speech, the First Amendment, and your 501c3 status. Today is October 20th, 2020. I am Heather Barta. I am the coordinator of Province 5, and I am thrilled to be with you tonight. My role is to start this meeting off and to remind everybody about Zoom and how Zoom works. There is a mute button, and I invite you to put all of yourselves on mute. There is a chat box. If you've not yet found that, it looks like lots of people have found that. But along the bottom, it says chat, and you can open that chat box and you can post questions in there. At some point, if you have any questions, if we're in that spot, then you can unmute yourself to ask your question and do that piece. But we know that sometimes background noise can get in the way. So keep yourselves muted as you are able. So I am thrilled to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Marcia Ledford, who is the convener of the Public Theology Network for Province 5. And she is our host for today and this mini-series, and she will take it away from here.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's go right into it. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, slideshow. All right. Okay. So today, last week we talked about theological foundations for our doing public theology. And we talked about how Moses and Jesus of Nazareth were our two greatest political theologians, and that we have much to learn from them. So we're going to take that theology that we talked about, and now we're going to talk about the First Amendment a little bit and some of the different ways that folks perceive how the First Amendment works. Okay? So going back to political theology, we talked about how it has a formula: see, think, act. You see suffering, you recognize it, you develop strategies or ways of dealing with it, minimizing it, making it go away, whatever, and then you act on it. So we've got an important fellow with us here, Adonis Flores, who is the chief immigration organizer for Michigan United. And he's going to talk to us about action and specific ways that we can get involved and ways that he has been involved since he was a young man. And not that you're old now. Anyway, and then so we address matters that are important to us because of our faith. And then we articulate this theology in a way that is accessible to the widest possible sector of the American public. So I borrowed this definition from a theologian hero of mine, Martin E. Marty. So there you go. See, think, act, and then broadcast to as large an audience as possible. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in the way that progressive Christians view the First Amendment versus more traditional members of Jesus's vineyard. Okay. And first of all, I want to say that I think a lot of progressive Christians think that we cannot speak our faith in the public square because it'll violate our 501c3 status. And this generally is not true. We do have some limitations on what we can do and say, and Adonis is going to talk about that in much more detail in his presentation. But I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and put the First Amendment up here and ask somebody to read it for us, and read it slowly by clause. Somebody?
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government to a redress of grievances.
Excellent. Thank you. So there they are: religion, free exercise, speech, press, assembly, peaceably to assemble, and to petition. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The First Amendment is only 45 words long, but it is one of the most astonishing documents in the history of humankind. It set us on a path that has often been referred to by James Madison as the American experiment, affording people this level of speech against the government, and specifically at that time, monarchies, was unheard of. And we left England, the Puritans left England for religious freedom. So all of that history is very much, you can read between the lines and see all of that history evolving in front of you. When the Supreme Court hears a religious freedom case, it is almost always balancing the Anti-Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, because those two aspects of the first clause are related to one another. If I go back, the establishment of religion is here, and prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They're only separated by a comma here. So they kind of come together in concert, right? So the Supreme Court is always going to be dealing with this tension between the two clauses. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different perspectives on our First Amendment rights. Okay? So I have AEC stands for the Anti-Establishment Clause up here, right? And then here are the other rights that we just read about. But for conservatives, their exercise of religion dominates their political ethos. And we're seeing this right now, particularly in the Senate. There's a very close alliance, and I would go so far as to say a significant amount of cronyism that is forwarding the conservative view, say, on abortion and gay rights and racial reconciliation. You could go on and on. But there's definitely a strong idea that their right to exercise their religious preference pretty much outweighs everything else. And they don't really worry about the Anti-Establishment Clause because Protestantism has been basically the religion of the realm. It's unofficial, but since well before the Declaration of Independence. So there's a very strong history there, and it's kind of like a fish not knowing it's in water. Okay. Now, let's go look at what the progressive folks are up to. Typically what we see is we are very concerned about the Anti-Establishment Clause. Why do you think that might be?
We never want to step on anybody's toes.
Bingo. That's right. Anybody else?
Sometimes we're just too nice.
We're just too nice.
Yeah.
I frankly think that there is something to that. Now, speaking to our Episcopal selves, there's an element of maybe not wanting to make a scene. Let's be honest, okay? Propriety and so forth. So what we end up doing is letting our worry about the anti-establishment clause sort of silence or outweigh these other rights that we have. Now I've got the press over here because the press does factor in, and I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that demonstrates that beautifully. But most of us aren't journalists. Most of us aren't, engaged in producing the news. And so this protection is a little bit, it's a little bit different. Now, we do have the right to receive news that is produced without censorship. We have that right. Okay, so these five work together, but not always. When I elect to be worried about this instead of exercising my my religion, I'm not too worried about the press here. I'm much more worried about these issues. Does that make sense to people? I got a big nod over here from Natalie. Excellent. Okay, so what we need to do is let all of these things be balanced. We need to let them come into play when they need to come into play. And the conservatives need to have more respect for this. And we need to get out there and have more action where free exercise is concerned. All of these things we need to be more active with. It's hard to convince white folks sometimes that it's important to get out there and be vocal because we enjoy white privilege. So here's Adonis. He's in downtown Detroit. Anybody who's been to Detroit has seen probably the Spirit of Detroit. And typically when we're in the playoffs with one of our professional teams, he's got their jersey on. What does this say, Adonis? End police something now. I don't remember.
I think it was brutality.
And okay, enter police brutality. So he's demonstrating speech in the public square that pops up. This is part of our First Amendment, and we've got the press covering it. We're talking about, we're assembling, we're addressing the government for the redress of our grievances with respect to children being separated from families, from their parents, from deportation, and so on. There can be time, place, and manner restrictions, but for the most part, we can go out and do and say what we want, assuming that it remains peaceful. Okay? So, and lots of kinds of speech are protected, and some of it is pretty disgusting. But it's very important that our government not read into what messaging we are allowed to make and not make. So this is protected. This is from Charlotte a couple years ago, and this is protected. This, I think, was probably taken by a photojournalist. I took this, but they're both protected. So if our message of love and inclusion and care and mercy and compassion, if this is protected, then our messages are, they're protected. We are protected. Now, this has got an expletive in it, and I should have warned you, but this is when the statues were being torn down, the Confederate statues. And you can see what he thinks of that. And that's protected speech, even though there's an expletive that comes from a case in the 60s over the draft. A guy had a t-shirt that said this word, the draft. His free speech was upheld. So we have broad protections. Now, here's what I was talking about earlier when the press kicks in. You know how with the scale of justice, there were the 4 stars and then the press little star was all by himself. Well, here is another really good example of how all of them are working together. Adonis and I were at St. Gabriel Roman Catholic Parish in Southwest Detroit. This was in 2016. And so we're in a church building. People are assembled. We are petitioning for the redress of a grievance, again, separation of families, right? So we are exercising free speech, and we are exercising an element of our free exercise of religion. So you've got all of these wonderful rights they're directly in operation because it was a press conference, so that we had press people there. Remember that day, Adonis? Do you remember that day? You're muted.
Oh, yes.
Any comment?
Well, the thing I want to point out is we have an imam,
Yes.
a Lutheran pastor,
Mm-hmm.
an Episcopal pastor, and a Catholic priest,
Yeah.
all conveying the same message.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
Right.
think we were gonna get we were also gonna get a rabbi, but it was a conflict in their schedule.
Yeah. But we do work really hard. And, you know, being in Detroit, we have the largest Muslim Arab population in the world outside of the Middle East. So it's very important for us to include our Muslim sisters and brothers in our work. Here's a lament to systemic violence. And you can see this was somewhat after Ferguson, Palestine, Detroit, and Adonis, if you move your head, people can see your photo. So there's the same photo that's here. Adonis took this. He's a really fine documentary photographer. And so here, you know, what if we took a crowd like this, although many, many more, and when the state legislature is debating adding, support for women and infants and children to up their subsidies, and we stand around the state capitol and share a Eucharist, share the common supper, and invite more people to the table to be fed. Could stage an eviction when somebody's deported and the chaos that ensues, and talk about Jesus as a refugee, and talk about how people leave their home country to save their lives, to find a way to make a living. So that's it. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Adonis. And
Marcia, you had some questions?
Oh,
do you want those now or later?
Let's do them. I'll stop sharing this.
So we had some comments in the chat, so hopefully people are able to see those. But one of the questions was, what about hate speech?
Oh, that's good. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I don't know how much ink has been spilled on these topics, but hate speech often falls under the free speech category. There are certain categories of speech that are limited. So it's basically evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So it's hard for me to state a rule about how free speech is treated. But it's a very good question, and it's something that we need to be talking about a lot more, because there's a lot of hate speech being used. And personally, I think it's a slippery slope, and when you start controlling what is okay to say when the government is the arbiter of that, it's not good. So we need to find other ways to address hate speech. Yeah.
Thanks. The other one that sort of popped up near the end was, does the free exercise of religion include giving sanctuary?
I believe that it does. And I don't know if there's specific case law with respect to that, but I can certainly find out. Do you know if there's any specific case law, Adonis or Alan?
Yep. So it's one of those things that is in the balance depending on who is in power. We do have two families living in sanctuary. We have a Muslim woman living at Kalamazoo First Congregational Church, Sahida. She is under threat of deportation, and she's living there. She's been living there for more than 2 years now to avoid deportation. And we also have an Albanian family, that Ransford guy, living at Detroit Central United Methodist Church. He's okay if he gets deported, but his wife has multiple sclerosis, very advanced, and he's the main caregiver. And if he gets deported, there's not going to be anybody left behind to care for the wife. So in this situation, they chose to break the law, not abide by their deportation order, and take sanctuary at a church. And our political calculation is that it would be very outrageous for ICE and the police to break into a church to pull them out and deport them. And that for that reason, ICE or the police will not dare go inside. And it has, or at least this has been the case for the last 2 years. This was the case also a lot during the 80s, when there was also a lot of sanctuary cases. I was not alive yet, but I kind of know the history of where our current sanctuary movement comes from. So in general, it is one of those things that is pushing the envelope, but politicians and law enforcement would rather not stir the pot, because they think that if they go in and invade a sanctuary, that there will be a lot of outrage, not just from us, but from other people of faith.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What other questions do we have? You guys are asking excellent question. Yes, the First Amendment rights cover undocumented folks, and Adonis is going to talk about that in just a minute. What else do we have?
I think that those were the big ones, because I think that there are some pieces that are going to get covered later, and if not,
That's
we'll come
right.
back.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to turn this over to Adonis, and I'm delighted that he was able to be with us tonight. He is incredibly busy right now with election protection organizing, and so we're delighted to have him here. Adonis is the Chief Immigration Director at Michigan United, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Mother Marcia, for inviting me. So first, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about myself, my story. I'm also going to share my screen. Can folks see my screen?
Yes. So
I met Mother Marcia. I was just writing about this back in 2013, when there was an influx of children seeking asylum at the border, and some of them were transferred to Michigan, Vassar, Michigan, a very, very small rural village, rural community, where there was a refugee shelter. So they were being housed there temporarily until they found more permanent home. And there, a lot of the local armed folks were very angry about it. So they started protesting with, exercising their First Amendment right to, their Second Amendment right to bear arms, and intimidating the the people and working in this facility, and of course the children staying in this facility. And Mother Marcia organized a donation drive of toiletries that we could take to the children there at Vassar. And at the moment, I was very disappointed with religion in general. I myself am a gay man, and I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition. So I was very disappointed about how religion in general has been very unfair to the gay community, and in many cases oppressive, and even you know, promoting hateful crimes against the LGBTQ community. But when I met Mother Marcia, what shocked me was that she was lesbian, and Father Juan was gay, and I was like, oh my God, is this allowed? So after getting to know her and getting to know more about the theology that she was promoting, I kind of reconnected spiritually and more with my faith. And I wanted to bring that up because part of my story involves my work in communities of faith, which would not have been possible or would not have been as successful if I had not come across Mother Marcia and the projects that we work together with the Episcopal Church. So a little bit about myself in terms of what is the work that I do. I am the Immigrant Rights Campaign Director at Michigan United and at Michigan People's Campaign. And the reason why I do this work is because I myself was an undocumented immigrant for most of my life here in the US. I came to Michigan when I was 8 years old as an undocumented immigrant. And I knew from the beginning that I was undocumented. And back then in 98, we did not have the deportation machine that we have today. ICE did not exist. We just had Border Patrol. And I remember even back then when things were not as bad as they are right now, I was always afraid of my mom being deported and our family being separated. And I remember that every time my mom would come home from work late because she stopped by to buy groceries or because she stayed to work overtime, I would panic. I would cry. And I can only imagine that nowadays, under this current administration, with the current political machine that we've built over the last 20 plus years, that children nowadays live with much more fear than I lived when I was a kid. Nevertheless, as I grew older and became more mature and independent, I started losing a lot of this fear. And on the contrary, I started getting a lot more courage to take more risks and to be more outspoken about the injustices that our communities are living. The first time that I went to a protest, it was on May 1st, 2006. And I remember it was the Sunday before. Somebody at church went up at the end of service and invited us to come to this march. And they said, this May 1st, don't go to work, don't go to school, don't shop, come to the march. Congress is about to pass a new law. It was the Sensen Burner Bill. And if the Sensen Burner Bill had been approved, it would be a felony to be an undocumented immigrant. It would be a felony to provide any services to undocumented immigrants. So a teacher that would teach an undocumented child would be a felon. A landlord that would rent to an undocumented tenant would be a felon. And of course, a bus driver that would allow an undocumented immigrant to get on its bus and ride the bus would be a felon. It was a very toxic bill. We were able to stop it with that march, but nevertheless, the rhetoric and the hate against immigrants kept growing over the years. And it wasn't until January 20, 2009, the same day President Obama took office, that I decided to get more involved. And the reason why I decided to get more involved was because my own uncle, my uncle Ivan, my mom's youngest brother, He's only 6 years older than me, so we kind of grew up like siblings. He got deported on that day. And that's when I realized that I had to do more. And I started looking for the people that organized the rally. I started looking for my political home, my place to fight for justice. And eventually, I met many people across the state that were like-minded, and we created that political home because it did not exist. We created Michigan United. And before Michigan United existed, one of the first activities that one of the First Amendment activities that we organized was a pilgrimage from Western International High School, which is a predominantly immigrant school in Detroit, to Ann Arbor, to the big house, the stadium, the football stadium, because President Obama was going to be there in 2011 in May, giving a commencement address to the graduating class. This was before DACA existed, and undocumented students had no protections whatsoever. So we wanted to go and deliver the message to the president that we wanted him to support the DREAM Act. And on that day that he was going to be here, there was a group of undocumented students that were doing a pilgrimage from Miami all the way to the White House. They were going to arrive at the White House on that day, but the president wasn't going to be there. So we took that message to him. And I was kind of discouraged. A lot of these experiences were like, I started discouraged because I felt that not enough people cared. It was only a handful of us walking. But when we got to Ann Arbor, hundreds of people joined us on a protest. And it was the first time that I came out as undocumented and unafraid publicly in front of the media. And I took that risk because I knew that I could. I knew that if I got deported, I had a place to go back home and I was going to be okay. However, a lot of immigrants don't have that, and a lot of immigrants cannot take those risks. So I decided to keep taking more risks. And unfortunately, that was not enough to pass the DREAM Act. It never became law. It never passed the filibuster in the Senate. And I remember the last chance that it got an opportunity at being passed. After finding out that it failed, I got depressed. I got very depressed, and I didn't do anything for many months. But other youth continued fighting across the country. And in more than 30 states, they did sit-ins at President Obama's re-election campaign offices in June of 2012. And their demand was very clear. We're not leaving until President Obama stops deporting dreamers. So that gave the president and his campaign staff two options. They could call the cops and get these students kicked out of their office, arrested, and they could go on knocking doors and getting the president reelected, which would probably cost them the Latino vote. Or he could give them what they wanted. And so the next day, President Obama decided to do a press conference in the Rose Garden announcing that he was going to create an executive action to stop the deportation of undocumented students. And that's the DACA program that we have now. So that taught me a lesson. It taught me that we're not always going to win the things that we want when we're fighting for justice. But if we fight, things are going to get better. Because that program benefited 800 students like myself, 800,000 students like myself, that changed their lives. They were able to get protection from deportation. They were able to get a work permit. So a lot of them were able to go to college, graduate, get careers, their incomes double, triple. In my case, my income tripled and now more than quadrupled. But it literally pulled us out of poverty. And that's when I learned that we always have to keep fighting for these just causes that we believe in. And that's what organizing is about. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our theory of organizing and how we view it. Normally, when we think of organizing, we think of the civil rights movement, which is a good example of organizing. We think of the Montgomery bus boycott. We think of the counter sit-ins, the Selma voting rights march. We think about all the violence that was inflicted on these organizers and these activists. But what we don't think about is all the power that it took to win those changes. One of the biggest obstacles to winning social change and winning these justice that we want to see in our communities is how much power did it take? And the civil rights movement was successful because it built power. And to build power, you need two main things. You need organized people and organized money. You also need information, the right information, right? You need to know exactly what is the problem and what are the best solutions. However, if you don't have organized money or organized people, your power is going to be very limited. And any institution functions under these basic powers structures. The corporations, for example, they have a lot of organized money, right? And on the progressive movement, we don't have a lot of money, but we do have some money. We need to organize it well. But what we do have is a lot of people, and we need to organize the people. And because the civil rights movement organized a lot of money and organized a lot of people, they were able to win a lot of things. So in that, keeping that method of organizing in mind, in order to win the changes that we want to see in the world, affordable wages, stopping the deportations that separate families, ending police brutality and racism against the Black community, we need to organize people and we need to organize money. And we need to organize this in strategic campaigns that will change the structures that create this inequality and poverty. And the most important thing is it has to be, we have to do all of this by putting the people most directly affected at the center of the decision making, because they are the ones that have the best solutions. So for example, a lot of people support ending police brutality against the Black community, but they disagree with a lot of the demands from the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's a flaw in that because the Black community are the ones that are most affected, and they're the ones that know what is the best solution. So if we really support ending this racism and police brutality, we really need to support the demands from the Black community. So I'm not going to go into that. There's a whole nother training on power that we could do on another day. But I'm going to move on by explaining that in our organization, the way we're building that power is by building a coalition of faith, labor, and service organizations that reflects the geography and the population of the state of Michigan. The only way we are going to achieve change in Michigan, for example, is if we involve everybody that's affected in Michigan. And the other way we're going to win these campaigns is by developing the leadership of the people that are directly impacted by these injustices, because they're the ones that have the solution and they're the ones that are struggling. So one of the ways we do that is by fighting in three fronts. We need to fight for justice in many fronts. Obviously, different institutions do it in different fronts. Our organization focuses in organizing through service, through politics, and through advocacy. And of course, the main goal is achieving justice in many of these issues that I mentioned. And the way we build the leadership, for example, in the immigrant rights campaign, is people come to us looking for services. They want to apply for citizenship. They want to apply for DACA, or they have a loved one that is being deported and they need help. When we are helping with that service, they are clients, but it's not enough to just provide that service. We need to then offer them the opportunity to develop their leadership by getting involved, coming to trainings on community organizing, on leadership, on how to have meetings with elected officials, on how to negotiate with the people in power, on how to do a structural analysis or a power analysis. And of course, very importantly, also on how to doing protests and civil disobedience. And by continuing to engage them in these trainings and developing their leadership, then they're taking over and building more leadership themselves with more people in the community. One example of how we need to uh, tackle the problems from the root is through the power analysis, the structure analysis of the issues that are impacting us, or in other words, following the money. So, for example, the deportations that are separating the immigrant families. When we follow the money, who's profiting off of putting kids behind cages, of deporting our parents? It's the same people that are profiting off of putting Black people behind bars. It's the private prison companies. They're the ones that wrote and sponsored the Sensen Burner bill that was being voted on in 2006. And here's one example of evidence that we know that they benefit from this financially, and they know about it, and they want to keep the status quo. This is a quote from the Corrections Corporation of America annual report filed with the Securities Exchange Commission. And it's the demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices. These private prison companies are also members of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchanges Council, which is an organization that basically writes conservative proposals for law and then tries to encourage lawmakers to pass those bills into laws. And one example is another quote from Michael Horta, a former ALEC task force director. Now, truth in sentencing laws based on an ALEC model bill require inmates to serve 80 to 90% of their sentences before becoming eligible for parole. So all of these, they know very well that putting more people behind bars, whether it's immigrants or Black people, it's increasing their profits, and they're willing to do that in order to increase their power. So what is the way in which, when we put into action our theory of organizing? Once we cut the issue, once we identified who profits of our injustice and who benefits from it, and we identify the problem, and we identify who is the person that can change the status quo, who can give us what we want, we meet with them and negotiate. We listen, we do research, we make proposals. If the negotiations don't go well, we do a direct action, we do a protest, we escalate is what we call it. And then try to force them again into the table. When they're on the table again, in the negotiating table, we might get what we want or not. And if the negotiations fail again, we escalate and protest even harder with more tension. And we come back, negotiate. And that process keeps going on and on until there is a final negotiation where both parties most of the time are exhausted and they just want to resolve the issue. But the important thing is not getting there, it's how we get there. Along the process of these, we're building the leadership of the people impacted. If we fail to do that, we're failing to organize the community. If we don't train more people on how to do this, if we don't do civic engagement and teach about how our democracy works and how to harvest the power of the people in the community, we're failing. So this is an example of some of those services that we offer at Organization Michigan United. We have a legal clinic. We help with citizenship classes, DACA renewals. We used to have citizenship classes. We just got a grant. We're going to start having ESL classes again next year. These are some examples of some protests we did for justice reform. This was after Michael Brown got shot like 4 years ago. We were marching with a lot of pastors out in the streets holding our hands up. This is the day that President Obama announced DACA. And here is, we're holding a press conference to make sure that USCIS is actually accepting applications that they say they would. And if they were not going to accept applications, we were going to have protests. But if they were accepting applications, we're just going to have a press conference celebrating it and a workshop helping people apply. And of course, protests in favor of raising the wage, protests in favor of environmental justice. One of the campaigns we're doing in Detroit, next to the Marathon Refinery, zip code 48217, which is the most polluted zip code in our state. We're demanding that the company creates a buffer zone by buying the property of the neighbors so that they can relocate to a place where they can breathe, and that neighborhood gets turned into a buffer zone with no housing. And then, of course, down ballot democracy, encouraging people to register to vote, encourage them to vote, encourage them to be engaged in the civic process, hosting candidate forums, debates, everything that's nonpartisan can be on the C3 side. But then we also need to find in the political side. And when we go to the political side, Michigan United as a 501c3 is not allowed to be involved, but we can create another organization that's not a 501c3. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. And of course, the things that a 501c3 can do is they can talk about issues. We can talk about whether or not our faith supports separating families and putting kids in cages or not. We can talk about whether or not we support police brutality against Black communities. We can, as long as it's in a nonpartisan way, what we cannot do as a 501c3 organization is discuss candidates and political parties or implied support or endorsement for any of them. And of course, donations are usually tax deductible. And one of the big differences between nonprofit like Michigan United and a faith organization is a lot of times your own faith also has more strict policies that you also have to abide for. But all of this is permissible under the law. What you can also do is, since you cannot do your funds, you cannot use your 501c3 funds for those activities, you can create a 501c4 organization for those activities. So for example, we created Michigan People's Campaign as a 501c4 organization that can conduct unlimited lobbying. We can have unlimited meetings with elected officials about issues, about bills and proposals. We can also get more directly engaged in politics by educating voters about candidates and their positions on the issues. However, we can technically not endorse candidates. What we can do is, as a 501c4, we can create an independent expenditure committee, either in the form of a PAC or a super PAC, and then the PAC or super PAC can endorse those candidates. And then, of course, 501c4 donations are not tax deductible. So there is a sheet that I shared with everybody that has more in detail about activities that are permissible at the federal level. You got to keep in mind that there is some state laws. Some states might have stricter laws on this than others. And again, your faith, your own structure of your church might also have a more strict rules about this. But this is what at the federal level, what is permissible under a 501c3 and a 501c4 organization. You all receive this in your email. One of the big, I'm gonna get to what is not over here, right? So that we can actually cover what is different. So under most states, including the state of Michigan, we cannot distribute voter guides on public to complete candidates on issues of importance to organization as a 501c3. But we can do it as a 501c4. The other thing that we cannot do is conduct voter registration and GLTV activities on party affiliation or how people will vote. So for example, if we anticipate that people in the immigrant community are going to vote or going to join, are going to vote a specific way, our organization as a 501c3 cannot just register people to vote in that immigrant community. We have to register people to vote in other places as well. On the C4 side, we can target by those expectations. Endorse candidates, again, C3 cannot do it. C4 can, as long as they create an independent expenditure committee. Campaign contributions are not allowed on either one. Some states allow it, but not in Michigan. And establish for 501c4 organizations specifically. And of course, establish and pay for the administrative fundraising costs of political organizations, not allowed for 501c3. A 501c4 can do it. So all of these, I'm gonna let you go ahead and review the sheet on your own. But in general, when you have a 501c4, the 501c4 can help the 501c3, but the 501c3 cannot help the 501c4. And that's usually how we measure what we're doing to stay legal. We use, the way I summarize this is, our organizations are tools that we need to use in the fight for justice, right? When we are doing our lawn, we need the lawnmower for the flat surfaces, but we need the weed hacker for the edges. When we are fighting for justice, we need the 501c3 for the nonpartisan stuff, but we need the 501c4 and independent expenditure for the political stuff. That is all I have for my presentation.
Thank you so much, Adonis. I think what we're going to do is hold questions if there are some, because we want to be sure Alan has enough time to do his presentation. And I'm so pleased to introduce him once again. He joined us for session 1, and he is the Church Relations Officer within the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations, where he helps manage their grassroots advocacy engagement and develops resources aimed at educating and equipping the church in policy advocacy. Prior to this, he lived and worked in Haiti with the Young Adult Service Corps, working in economic development, communication, and project management. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Clemson in South Carolina and is currently getting his master's in conflict analysis and resolution from the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Alan?
Thank you, Marcia, and Adonis, thank you for that. Enjoyed listening to what you had to share, and my expertise is not in grassroots organizing, so it was really helpful to hear your take on that and your assessment and the balance between 501c3 and C4s. And I think hopefully for folks, putting another dot on your advocacy map, you'll be able to make connections between what Adonis shared and what I'll get into from the perspective of the Office of Government Relations. So hopefully you all should be able to see the U.S. Capitol building, a couple of recognizable flags. But I wanted to kind of do a very brief version of a more detailed advocacy training that we do to give you a sense of the types of tools that we use in our advocacy work. The Episcopal Church's church-wide office that we're a part of does engage in some grassroots organizing and various support, has various support mechanisms for protesting and movements out on the street, so to speak. For example, we are like a part of the Poor People's Campaign, but our office doesn't get involved in that piece. We focus more on the government relations aspect of it, which I mentioned in the session a couple of weeks ago, is something that's done in parallel to some of this grassroots organizing and the protesting and work on the ground. It's not meant as a replacement. It's simply a component of the broader strategy that is needed to pursue justice. I highlighted in that presentation as well this op-ed by President Barack Obama from earlier this summer, where he talked about these parallel tracks of engagement, saying, in a sense, that our aspirations have to be translated into specific laws and institutional practices. We do that through voting, of course, we're in an election season, and in holding our government officials, our elected officials accountable while they're in office. And that's really what our work is about. And I want to pose a question to you all to reflect on for a little bit that I think can change the nature of our thinking about this type of work. Typically, when we think of policy advocacy and lobbying and political engagement, we think of sort of shaking our finger or our pens and saying, vote yes, vote no, I support this issue, I'm against this issue. But I think it also helps to look at that in another way, and to really think about it as relationship building, and ask, what value does our church have to the government? What do we bring to the table as an institution that in many ways serves the public? What unique perspectives, resources, what unique voices do we have that can help the government actually address these problems, rather than just only taking an adversarial perspective, or one that is critiquing, looking at it more as a relationship. So with that, I want to kind of walk through really a lot of the tools and processes that are at our disposal, and that can certainly be at your disposal as well in your own advocacy work. And we think about all of these as kind of taking this almost like the shape of an iceberg, where a certain number of them are more public, but there's a lot of other work, a lot of other action that takes more time, that's below the surface, but it's all connected and works together. So to start, I'll go through a few of the tools that we have that you all may be familiar with and may have seen from our office or even from your diocese or parish. The first being public statements. The Episcopal Church can speak out publicly on public policy matters, whether that's legislation or policy changes. These are just some examples here. Occasionally we will release a statement on our own or independently, but we also will join either sign-on letters, something called sign-on letters, where multiple organizations may be signing on to the same document. And then that could be a public, almost like a press release. It could be a letter that is directed to a specific individual or even a group of individuals in the government. You can see here the Justice Declaration. It's fairly old now, several years old now, but I like highlighting it because it's a great example of how we've worked together across a pretty politically diverse number of churches to speak out on criminal justice reform. But we've also done, so just in the month of July, we did 4 sign-on letters related to COVID-19. We've done dozens of them have sort of crossed our desk that we've analyzed and assessed in terms of whether or not we want to join them as the Episcopal Church to talk about various justice issues and the implications of the current pandemic, the government response, the economic impact, both on U.S. citizens, immigrants in the U.S. who are not citizens, and international community writ large as well. In addition to public statements, our office produces what we call action alerts. You may receive those through the Episcopal Public Policy Network already. If you would like to, it's easy to join the EPPN, and we'll make sure you have that link to do so. But these are essentially very specific calls to action to write your members of Congress, typically, although action alerts can be directed really at any elected official and occasionally at government agencies if there is a comment period open for a particular proposed policy change. So this was a recent one we sent out that is expressing broader support for the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, but highlighting in particular a few elements that are important to protecting Indigenous women who have in different ways essentially been left out of these protections that are in the VAWA Act in the past. And we need to address those in this current iteration. So these we send out in a time, hopefully a strategic moment when we hope something can move, whether it's getting a bill through a committee in Congress, getting it onto the floor, or ultimately passing it. We try to direct these calls to action at strategic points in that process. We also, of course, have social media and email, sort of basic communication that we can do remotely that complements and hopefully facilitates all of this work. It's where we can share our educational material as well. We use advocacy campaigns to help highlight more details and nuance into the issues that we're covering. We're currently in the midst of the US election, of course, and so we've done an educational series on the US election with our most recent installment, What to Expect When You're Electing. I did not come up with that title, but I really do appreciate that title. But this just gives an opportunity to hopefully curate the expectation that advocates need to be informed and educated about what they're doing, whether you're involved through grassroots movements or in communicating directly with legislators, it helps to be informed about the topic. And in some cases, you may end up finding yourself more informed than the people that you're meeting with or talking to. And that goes back to the first question I started with: what is your church's value? What is the church's value to the government? Sometimes we can be bearers of information. That's often the case. For example, we have a refugee resettlement agency, Episcopal Migration Ministries, and often we speak to members of Congress who are not very familiar with that program, and we're able to share information, stories, data about that in a very specific way, because we have such a close relationship with that particular ministry and activity. So again, educational resources, we have trainings and workshops that we do, longer versions of this current little spiel right now. We have 2 election webinars. One we just did this afternoon at 3, and the next one is next Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern, where we'll talk about voting beyond 2020. In other words, yes, we're focused on the election right now, and it's important, and we still need to get out the vote. But what's going to happen after election day and before inauguration day? What do we do even beyond that, and how do we make sure that we think about voting as part of a longer cycle? We also have a civil discourse curriculum that is available online to take individually, but I also have done smaller workshops on this topic to help us engage with one another in conversation that can enhance our understanding of one another's positions and hopefully highlight in a constructive way the diversity that we have in our church and in our communities. We also have other printed resources, rather online resources that are hopefully that are there for your use. And the 3 that I want to highlight, we have our misinformation resource, which is designed to help you identify and combat misinformation, sometimes referred to as a disinformation, although we get into those terms. We look at it from a couple of different angles, both topical and source-based, to kind of help us unpack what misinformation really is. Our postcard project, Engaging in Slow Advocacy, is a guide for ministry leaders to use if they are wanting to engage their parish or their ministry in writing Congress. This is a way to do so in sort of a constructive, thoughtful, and slower paced program to hopefully bring people together and have a discussion around the particular topic you want to speak out on. And then our Faith and Citizenship Guide, we just revised as a new sort of Advocacy 101 pro tips guide to doing advocacy in your own context. Our office focuses specifically on the federal level, representing the church's policies there to the U.S. federal government, but advocacy, it happens at all levels of our government, state and local level as well. And Adonis highlighted the importance of that in the election and the importance of engaging not just at one level of government, but in a strategic way where you understand who has the power to make the changes you want to see, and then direct your requests, direct your advocacy and relationship building towards those people. We also have done press conferences, newspaper op-eds. There, are other means of engaging publicly, delivering statements and holding prayer vigils, that sort of thing, are all ways to engage. We sort of think about above the water in this iceberg analogy. But underneath, which is, again, supports all of the work underneath the water, supports what ultimately comes to the surface. We build and strengthen congressional relationships. So our Office of Government Relations staff is meeting with congressional offices every day on a number of different issues that the church has policy on. And we build relationships with the members and their staffs as well, which can be really critical to this work. We maintain relationships with career officials, so people who are not in elected positions, and this helps us, in some instances, get to a more granular level on some issues, especially with foreign policy. But it also allows more continuity between elections when you may have personnel that change. Of course, every member is not reelected. Sometimes you have changes in the presidential administration. So having relationships with career officials can help maintain contact with the government through those periods of transition. We also make sure to offer gratitude and thanks. It's going along with the theme of relationship building. It's always helpful to acknowledge when someone's done something that we appreciate. that we want to see. And it's amazing how much that can contribute to the relationship building process. It's really important. It may seem simple to just say, hey, I noticed you did this. Thank you so much for supporting this bill. That can really go a long way and means a lot. The legislators don't hear that very often, even though there are still hundreds of bills each year that are passed, despite the certain issues and certain bills that do get held up for quite a long time. We as a church can inform, and we do inform the policy debate with expert and regional voices. Perhaps in your context, you run a soup kitchen or a community garden or a homeless ministry that can help inform city council and their decisions in addressing homelessness, for example, or there are various ways you can look at that on immigration, any number of issues. You can kind of connect these tangible ministries of the church with this process of advocacy. And in doing that over time, legislators will begin to seek out our own expertise as a church. They do that with our office. They do that with our faith partners, other faith organizations that have advocacy offices as well. And that they can end up asking us to contribute to bills, contribute to processes, speak at hearings. And then another way to kind of facilitate all of that would be internal letters and statements. These are similar to the sign-on statements that I spoke about earlier, but they're really meant more for sort of internal heads up, like, hey, this is happening, or your colleagues in Congress are wanting this to move forward, and we think that you would be ideal to support this. As well, would you co-sponsor this piece of legislation? There's a lot of that type of work behind the scenes as well that's not public, but is a critical part of the advocacy strategies. I mentioned co-sponsors. We track legislation, so looking at organizations, including our office, that track particular areas of particular subject matters. There are a lot of organizations out there that are engaged in this work and can be resources for you to give you a leg up. You don't necessarily have to do all of this work on your own. So in the Episcopal context and for federal legislation, we really are tracking a lot of different pieces of legislation and different issues in Congress and the federal administration, and hope that you can reach out to us for that. And then along those lines, also working in coalition. So I mentioned other denominations have advocacy offices, and we work with a lot of them. I encourage you to do that at the state and local level as well. It's a way that you can build new strategy, make interesting connections, recognize that you don't necessarily have to agree on every issue, but maybe there are some issues where there is overlap, where you do agree, and you can focus on those and work together in achieving and finding success in those particular issues. So my last couple of points here, sort of to summarize and reflect on all of these different pieces of advocacy, which can be looked at almost as tools to be used in different moments. I want to emphasize again, asking what is your ministry, or what is your church's, or what are you as an individual, what is your value add to the community? I mean, how can you lean into that to determine what you should be working on in any given moment? I mean, there are a lot of different issues that need to be addressed, but ultimately we've got to focus our efforts somehow. And that's one way to kind of sift through the opportunities for engagement, is to say, how can I be particularly effective in this area? And then to think about, issues where with a greater value add, usually you want to match those with like labor intensive tools that have a high reward. So if there's an area where you think, okay, we can be particularly effective in this, spend time, the slow, methodical, day-to-day time building relationships with elected officials who can influence those issues. Whereas other issues that may need public attention, use a tool that requires less time. So say, for example, you're very passionate about immigration, but there's some sort of local tragedy, like a school shooting, or something along those lines. You're not necessarily in a position to lean into intense advocacy, but you want to acknowledge and have a statement there. It can be quick and easy to put up an op-ed, to put up a statement online, to acknowledge that, to express a position in that moment, while you continue the day-to-day work on immigration sort of behind the scenes. So that I'll stop there. There's a lot of other details that I've gone into in other presentations, but hopefully that's helpful in the context of this evening.
That's terrific. Thank you, Alan, so much. And so we've got a few minutes left, I think. Just a couple. So if anybody's got a burning question, now's your time to pop it in the chat. Whoops. Hello. All right. Any questions? Heather is going to put the link to the survey for this session. I really encourage you all. The last question is always, is there anything else you'd like to say? That's an opportunity for you to say, hey, I want training on this, or I want to talk about this, because we do plan as the Province 5 Public Theology Network to offer more trainings, and but we need to know what you want. So there's no sense doing it unless we know that there's a need for it. So please do the survey. Anybody else?
Do you see the question from Lynn?
I'd like examples of churches who are doing this well. Doing what well, Lynn? Organizing and local advocacy.
Maybe Central United Methodist Church.
Central United we can talk about
Detroit.
Specifically in Detroit, for example.
Yeah. I mean,
the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America is very active and they're very active in migration ministries. I don't know what their community organizing is. We have an ELCA pastor on the Michigan United Board, Jack Eggleston.
Yeah, and also in Kalamazoo First Congregational Church. I mentioned that both of these churches, I mentioned that they were hosting a family living in sanctuary, but they're also hosting a whole lot of other groups that are fighting for social justice. For example, there's a group called the Poor People's Campaign that is also hosted at Central United Methodist Church. The People's Water Board, they're fighting for clean water in Flint and in Detroit. They're hosted at Central United Methodist Church in Detroit. In Kalamazoo, Kalamazoo First Congregational Church, they're also they have like a soup kitchen for the homeless. They're in front of a park where there's a large homeless population, and they're also organizing to end homelessness in Kalamazoo. So it's not they provide the service, right, the soup kitchen, but then they also organize with city council and they meet and try to push for bills to end homelessness in Kalamazoo. And so those are just some that I can think of the top of my head. But I don't know if other examples from the Episcopal Church are available.
That's what Lynn is asking. She wants examples of Episcopal churches. So you know what? I'm going to get back with you on that, okay? I'll have some more to report next week. Does that sound all right, Lynn?
Yeah, and I would just add, I think there's so many different ways to get involved in this work.
Yep.
You're not necessarily going to find a parish that like does everything. And they may do something well and they focus on that. And I think that's what's important. So maybe it's a parish that has a particularly visible place in town. How are they utilizing that space and using their grounds for sending a message, whether that's a protest message, if you want to describe it that way or not. The dioceses of Maine and Maryland both have really great state level advocacy networks that focus on their state legislatures. Iowa does state level engagement as well. There are a number of places that do around the church. at a diocesan level. But yeah, I mean, would love to follow up with you as well, Len, on that to see if I can point you in a more specific direction.
Okay, Deacon Marcia, are you there?
Do you mean Deacon Marcia?
Well, there's a Marcia
Or
too.
no, where's Marcia? Oh, she's muted. I see her. There she is.
Okay,
There she is.
Just got unmuted.
okay. Why don't you just pray and dismiss us out of here?
I'd like to pray from the BCP, the social justice effort prayer.
Excellent.
Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
And now
Amen.
let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and yes, to make wise and good trouble.
Thanks
Amen.
be
Thanks be to
to
God. Yay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.